the fair folk, good neighbours, the kindly ones, wee folk, spirits, the underworldly, even gods and goddesses. Call them what you will, just never call them fairies. At least that is what a lot of traditional folklore tells us. You should not name them. So let's hope they're not watching this video, because I'm about to say the word fairies a lot. As you can probably tell from the title of this video, we're going to be talking today about books featuring fairies. And besides that, there are no rules. So we're going to be talking about horror books, fantasy books, romance books, children's books, young adult books, and even non-fiction book. We've got some classics, we've got some newer titles, we've got a little bit of everything. Because if there's one thing about me you should know, it's that I love fairies. I grew up on traditional Scottish folk tales of the fair folk. I even heard tales from my granny about her own encounters with the fairies in her garden, and I could not get enough stories containing fairies as a child, and that is something that has continued to be true into my adulthood. But I've also very much enjoyed, as I've gotten older, learning more about the lore behind fairies and the fair folk, how depictions of fairies vary around the world, the different traditions concerning fair folk, how they have changed and transformed in traditional mythology and folklore, what they mean to different people, and also seeing how different authors have woven that lore into their work. There's some really different books in here, from, like I said, horror that maybe draw on some of the more sinister side of the fair folk, to tales about romances between humans and fairies. And I've just always adored seeing what exactly fairies mean to us, whether on like a cultural or an individual level, which is why I think it's fun that there are so many different books in this video. But I also wanted to mention that part of the reason I'm filming this video now is in honour of the fact that in May I do have 2 new anthology collections coming out with Macmillan Collectors Library. So Macmillan Collectors Library publish classics, and I have been working with them as an editor and an anthologizer for a few years now, compiling classic stories from around the world, some of which are now out of print, into single volumes concerning different figures from mythology and folklore, and the 2 I have coming out in May are on fairies and mermaids. So unsurprisingly, I went on a bit of a fairy deep dive last year when I was compiling these, and I'm so excited that they're going to be out there in the world, because some of my absolute favourite folktales are in both of these, like bind-ups, as well as my introduction and a little bit of a history of the terms and these figures. So while you perhaps wait for those volumes, if you do plan on picking them up, I thought I would recommend to you some of my favourite books featuring fairies, of which I think I have at least 20 to talk about. So without further ado, let us be done with the introductions and let's talk about the books. So these books are in no particular order, but the first one on my list is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. So this is the first book in an adult fantasy series which has a faux historical setting. At least that's how I often refer to books in fantasy worlds, where they're very clearly inspired by versions of our historical past but with changes. So maybe equally fantastical history or alternative history would work, and this one feels as though it's set in a version of Victorian Britain. But we are actually following Emily Wilde, who is an Oxbridge scholar who is out in the field studying the fair folk, or the fairies, of this small island in Scandinavia. It's a fake island, I believe. I don't think it's a real place. It's like a little island with its own local community and with some rare fair folk that you can't find anywhere else, and Emily Wilde is a fairy scholar. So I'm not just talking about the history of folklore or fairy tales, I'm talking about out in the field meeting these creatures and characters, a bit like maybe a biologist or a zoologist, if that's what they do. I'm just guessing, and I absolutely love that concept. I love a book that has a sort of light academia touch, maybe because I've spent so much of my life in academia, and I like seeing kind of the witty way that world is brought to life in this faux historical setting, but with the added bonus of it being so magical and fantastical. And I would say this is on the cozy side of fantasy, but there's certainly some drama and some danger. I love how it interacts with traditional fae folklore. I absolutely love the way those strands are woven in, and we get different kinds of fair folk throughout the book. And I love Emily Wilde And I love the characters, both of Emily Wilde and her co-worker, who does turn up during the book, but I won't say anything more about him because I don't want to give anything away. But their dynamic is so much fun. They have a bit of a love-hate dynamic and it's fun to read about, and the series in general is just absolutely charming. If you're looking for something a little bit darker though, a book that I think has a really interesting take on kind of fae folklore is You Let Me In. So I don't know if I would go so far as to call this a horror novel, but it's definitely a very dark, quite psychological story, where we are discovering the past of this world famous author who has disappeared, and her niece and nephew, I think it is, but her family members are going through her things because she's been missing for so long, and they find these like letters in this manuscript that she has left behind about her life. And she's always been a bit of an odd figure in the public eye. She had a husband who died under mysterious circumstances, and there's lots of secrets about her past and her family, and we are hearing them from her perspective as she's written it down for her family to find. And that includes her growing up as a child, as a teenager, as a young woman, and it's quite a traumatic childhood. There is a lot of allusions to child abuse in this book, so I think that's really important to bear going into it. But what makes this book really interesting is that throughout her life she has these fairy companions. She is friends with the fair folk, even the darker ones, and they are her constant companions, and she has these interactions with them throughout her life. But as a reader you can't help but wonder whether this is true or not, and if this is actually just a coping mechanism that she has come up with to deal with the trauma she's experiencing. And I think it's such an interesting way to use traditional folklore in a story and to kind of explore the ways in which our mind tries to protect us. So that is a really incredibly written, beautifully written, but emotional read. A classic, and one a lot of you've probably already read if you're into your fairy books, has to be the YA series by Holly Black that begins with The Cruel Prince. So this is, like I mentioned, a young adult fantasy series, which again does actually take a little bit of a darker approach to the fair folk, in the sense that our protagonist is a human teenage girl who has ended up being basically adopted by a fairy family because they murdered her real parents. And let me get this right, her adopted dad is the biological father of her oldest sister. So her oldest sister is half fae. She and her twin are not fairy, but they do get taken to the land of the fairies to be raised. And it is a cutthroat world, and it's particularly dangerous if you are a human and do not have the powers of the fair folk. And she's basically just trying to survive, which is not that easy, growing up surrounded by fairies. And she has a ton of very antagonistic relationships with different characters, which are fun to read about, and kind of who is and isn't the enemy is constantly changing. And then there's the like wider political machinations of the fairy realm, which she gets drawn into. And these are really fun books. I binged this series back when I think the third one came out, because I read them all back to back and could not put them down. They're a ton of fun. There's also a spin-off series which I haven't read yet, but I'm very much looking forward to. And more generally, Holly Black has actually written a bunch of young adult books that do play around with fairy lore, so she's an author worth checking out. So we've touched on adult books and young adult books, and I think that means we should make our next book a children's book, and the one I've got for you is Hedge Witch, which again, first in a series by Skye McKenna, which is a middle grade series about a little girl who is raised in a boarding school, and it's a very boring, very kind of miserable place, only to discover that there is actually magic out there, and that magic maybe has something to do with her family. So she ends up leaving the boarding school in the early section of the novel to go and live with her aunt, who is her mother's sister, and her mother disappeared years ago. Nobody knows what happened to her, and she is determined to find her mother, which leads her on some dangerous paths, including those that interact with the fairies. And what I love about this book is you've also got like witchcraft and magic and kids learning magic at this like local community sort of rural witchcraft school, which I love. But then you also have this fairy world, which very much reminds me of like the folk tales again that I grew up with as a kid, where you would read about fair folk kidnapping children and other humans and taking them to their realm, and that is reflected in this book, and I really love the setting. It's also just incredibly charming and witty, and I love our protagonist as well as her little cat companion, because you've got to have a magical cat in a book for children, don't you? Then there's an author who's actually written fairy books both for adults and for young adults, and that is Terry Pratchett. So within Terry Pratchett's Discworld, which is a much larger fantasy world that the author created, he did cover fairy lore, and he does have a few books and series within the Discworld that deal with fairies. The first of which is for adults, and it can function as a standalone, but it does also feature characters who are quite central to his witches series. So I think if you consider it a part of that series, it also works really well. And more specifically, it is a parody of A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's not the only Terry Pratchett book to parody some Shakespeare. For example, Weird Sisters is also littered with Shakespeare references, but this one is a ton of fun. Again, the fairies are wild and sometimes cruel and very, very entertaining, and they interact with the world of witches and other magical beings in this series. Is just, like I said, a ton of fun. It's kind of hard to summarise any Terry Pratchett book, but I do have to mention it. And then there is his We Free Men series, or the Tiffany Aching series, which begins with the We Free Men. Now this particularly I think is a fantastic place to start with the Discworld series. It is a young adult book, so it eases you in, I think, a little bit more to his writing style. It obviously is suitable for various different ages. I actually read it when I was maybe 10 or 11 for the first time and absolutely adored it, and it very much introduces a new protagonist character, so it doesn't feel like you need to be familiar with the other characters of his Discworld to read. It was the book that got me into Terry Pratchett actually, and it follows Tiffany Aching, a young girl who lives on a farm whose brother is kidnapped by the Queen of the Fae, and she has to work together with these little Scottish Pixies. Well, they're not technically Scottish because there's no Scotland in the Discworld, but they are very heavily inspired by Scotland, and they are just so hilarious. Maybe I have a particular soft spot for them because I am a Scot, but they're just so funny, and it's about her going to rescue her brother with these little Pixies. Alright, let's tackle another horror novel, and I do have some more horror coming up, but I just want to say at this point in the video, I would love more recommendations for fae-inspired horror. It's one of my favourite subgenres of horror, as well as more generally folk horror, so please do let me know. But for now, I just wanted to mention the Twisted ones, which for me was one of the creepiest reading experience I have to say I've had with a horror novel. Like, I've had more I've read more disturbing horror novels, I've read more like visceral horror novels, but this was one of those books that was very insidious, and I was reading and I'd sort of be like this. Any noise around me, I was like, what's going on? And I think that's partly because the character is experiencing that herself. We are following our lead protagonist who goes to clear out her hoarder grandmother's home after she's passed away. So she's taken on this responsibility by herself to clean everything out, and that's a massive job, and she's finding things as she goes through everything. It's just her and her dog, and one of the things she finds is the diaries of her grandfather, and it appears that her grandfather had experienced some sort of strange paranormal otherworldly like entity in his life that like never left him, and he became like obsessive about writing it down and all of his experiences and all of the thoughts in his head, and that's what she's reading. And then what she's reading sort of seeps into her own head and the landscape around her, which I believe is North Carolina. So she's in quite a rural setting, and she's surrounded by woods and nature and like the darker side of like what is in the woods, and you know, she hears noises and she can't stop thinking about certain things, and like I said, she spends a lot of time alone, just her and her dog, and it's very creepy and very good. I won't say much more than that because obviously I don't want to give anything away, but I love what T. Kingfisher did in this book. I thought it was fantastic. From horror to romance, one of the most recent fairy series that I have started reading is the Bonded by Thorns series by Elizabeth Helen. So at the minute there are 4 books in the series, but there are still more to come, and I have read books 1 and 2, although I'm desperate to read book 3, which is sitting in my bedroom right now, so I'm definitely going to be starting that soon. And this is just the perfect kind of escapist romantasy for me. If you're wanting a page turner series with lots of characters that you'll fall in love with, some steamy romance, some, yeah, like relationships and romances you're rooting for, and some wider political intrigue, as well as lots of like world building and magic, then this is perfect. It's so much fun. It begins as a loose retelling of Beauty and the Beast, but it obviously expands far beyond that, and we follow Rose, who ends up in the world of the Fae, where she is taken as a prisoner in this castle by a fairy prince who is also considered a beast. But it's not just him, there are actually 4 fairy princes living in this castle, 4 beasts, and it's why choose. She falls in love with them all as the novels unfold. Like I said, I've only read the first 2, but I'm really excited. There's lots of secrets, and I've got some sort of like guesses and theories about where it's all going to go, and I'm looking forward to finding out. But these are just like absolutely devourable. They're quite chunky books, but like I could not put them down, and I read them so quickly. They're so much fun. Then I have a recommendation which I do think is a little bit random, and I had to pull out my physical copy of it for you because I just absolutely love this thing. This is a book I have had since I was 15 years old. My mum actually bought it for my 15th birthday. I picked it out in a bookshop when I was with her, and that was, well, quite a long time ago now. I'm 33, so I've had this for a long time, and I still refer back to it. I think it's so much fun. But I have to say, the inside is also a little bit bizarre. So this is the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Fairies, which is by Anna Franklin and illustrated by Paul Mason and Helen Field. And it is, as you would expect, an encyclopedia. So we have here the letter E, which includes everything from earth fairies to Echo, the Greek nymph, to some fairies whose names are in Irish, and without having double checked in advance, I'm not going to try and pronounce them. And then like we have the bees here, we've got Blue Hag, we've got Blue Bell, everything. Like I'm telling you, if you can think of a term or a plant or a like just magical concept related at all to fairies, it's in this book, and I genuinely think it's such a good resource. It's been quite an inspiration to me as a writer, I think, over my lifetime. But I will say that the illustrations or photographs in here can be a little bit strange. It is very like early 2000s Photoshop, so like we've got things like this, which isn't actually the worst. A few people that have received a green skin treatment in Photoshop, like I mentioned. This, which looks like some weird CGI I would see in Xeno Warrior Princess in the 90s. But then there are some quite beautiful illustrations as well, like that's stunning. Like that's absolutely stunning. And there's actually something I think quite endearing about the photographs as well. I just think they're also a little bit strange. Haunting, some might say. But I have just loved this book for a very long time. I don't think it's in print anymore, but I did Google and it seems like there's a ton of copies secondhand online that you can pick up. So if anybody is really interested and wants a wee Encyclopedia of Fairies, this is a great one. Sorry, this just fell out of it. It is literally the price card from the bookshop, which is even dated on the back to 2006, which must be when they got it in the shop, because I was 15 in 2007, so they must have got it in the shop in 2006, and then I came along and bought it in 2007, and apparently it was $14.99. My next recommendation is something completely different, however, and that is a comic book series, and that is the I Hate Fairyland comic book series. Now this is very much a comedic comic book series about a little girl, well originally a little girl, who stumbles through a portal into the fairy world, a very popular trope in traditional folklore and in traditional like children's books that you've probably come across. However, she can't get out, and the years pass and the years pass and the years pass, and she has been here for decades, stuck in a child's body because she never ages whilst in the fairyland. And what starts off as like a fun adventure full of lollipops and fairies and like fun colours and silly magical creatures and unicorns just becomes hell for her. And it's about her trying to escape. And it's utterly bizarre but absolutely brilliant. Like conceptually that is so much fun, and the art style suits it so perfectly because it is this like super cutesy colourful style full of like blood and gore. It's such an interesting like juxtaposition, which I think captures the tone of the comic book series perfectly. Then a series which I don't think explicitly mentions fairies in the first book, but which I do have to mention here and just make you aware that fairies do become an integral part of the series, which is the Sookie Stackhouse series beginning with Dead Until Dark. So this is more commonly known as a vampire series. Vampires are very much at the centre of the series. It's the book series which inspired the TV show True Blood, and although at the beginning, if you've seen the TV show, they're very, very similar, the books very much diverge, like, well, the TV show very much diverged from the books and they're quite different by the end. So I think that's worth bearing in mind if you think, well, I've already seen the TV show, should I read the books? They're quite different and they're a ton of fun. But like I said, fairies do become quite integral to them. But in book one, we're following Sookie Stackhouse, who is a waitress in a small, like, rural town called Bontemps in Louisiana when she meets her first vampire. So recently, vampires have come out into the light. They have introduced themselves to society, they have exposed themselves because of the invention of True Blood, which is a synthetic blood replacement, which means they can live amongst humans and be known. And Sookie's kind of interested, she's fascinated by vampires, and she meets her first vampire, Bill, in book one, and slowly but surely gets dragged into the supernatural world, whether she likes it or not. And each book typically has a bit of like a mystery plot. There's a lot of like mysteries, both supernatural and like mundane, that Sookie ends up getting dragged into, and then you also follow her various different love affairs throughout the series. Another young adult book I want to mention is The Enchantment of Ravens, which for me is one of those books which creates a really beautiful and interesting like version of the Fae realm that feels very immersive. I really like when fairy books interact with nature. This is one of those books that very much kind of latches onto the seasonal aspect of magic in the fairy world and plays around with that, which I really enjoyed. And we spend a lot of time wandering through woods and the forest, which I just really like. And we follow our protagonist, who's a painter who is commissioned by a fairy prince to paint his portrait. But this is something that comes with a lot of danger, as fairies and the fairy realm often do for humans, and they kind of end up stuck with one another, which is another kind of trope I enjoy in my books, where our two main characters kind of are forced to spend time together. And another author who has written both young adult and adult books featuring fairies is one I'm sure you were prepared to see in this video, and that is Juliet Marillier. So there's a lot of books I could talk about here, and I'm going to try and rattle through them a little bit just to give you a brief introduction to each one. So the first series I want to mention is the Seven Waters series, which starts with Daughter of the Forest. This is an adult 6-book series where each book follows a different character who is from a different generation in the same family, of the Seven Waters family. So they kind of function as standalone books. There's definitely overarching themes, particularly with the like wider magic of the world, but the journey and story of each central character is rounded up in each book, which is like I said, always a woman of the Seven Waters family. And in the first book we are actually following Sorcha, who has to save her brothers. It's a retelling of the like Swan Brothers fairy tale, and in doing so she interacts often with the world of the Fae. These books are set in medieval Ireland, so they have like a historical backdrop, but you also, like I said, interact with the fair folk throughout. So that's kind of the backdrop for those books. They're absolutely stunning, so immersive, so beautifully written, so atmospheric. Absolutely love them. And you can actually expect similar things from most of Juliet Marillier's adult books. Similarly, The Harp of Kings is another adult series by Juliet Marillier which interacts with the fair folk, and this is actually set in the same world as the Seven Waters series. Technically, in fact, it's a spin-off of her Blackthorn and Grimm book series because it's about the next generation in that family, but it very much functions as a standalone, like I said. And we follow 3 characters who have been trained as like spies and warriors, Fairies. We then have 2 YA series I wanted to mention by her, the first of which is Wildwood Dancing, which is a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses, and this is one in which you get fairies, you get vampires, you get a group of sisters travelling to a magical other world, and you get talking frogs. So, you know, tick tick tick. And then lastly we have Shadowfell, which is a YA trilogy set in a fictional fantasy world very heavily inspired by Scotland, in which magic has been suppressed and banned by the like evil ruling king, except our main character has this magical ability to speak with and call to the fair folk, which makes her a caller, and that puts her in danger and she ends up part of the rebellion. And all of these books are fantastic. Everything Juliet Marillier writes is fantastic. There are other books by Juliet Marillier which also have fairies in them, but there's 4 I've highlighted for you. Alright, so my list is significantly shorter, but the next one I want to talk to you about is actually behind me, so let's just grab it, shall we? This is the Fearsome Fairies collection from the British Library. So this is part of a series that the British Library publish, which I absolutely adore, not just because they're stunning, but because they anthologise, well, creepy stories on various different themes, and a few of those are fairy tale and folklore themed, but again with that sort of dark and creepy vibes. And it includes stories by Arthur Machen, Frances Hodgson Burnett, J.M. Barrie, Fiona MacLeod, M.R. James, Marjorie Lawrence, J. Sheridan Le Fanu, who are all authors that you might recognise. You know, we've got the author of Carmilla in there, we've got the author of Peter Pan in there. So what Elizabeth Darnley has done here is compile a collection of stories featuring dark and creepy fairies from classic authors like those I've just mentioned to you. There's a lot of inspiration taken from traditional folklore by the authors in this book, but also they have created something new and something of their own in writing their own stories, and I think that they're all fantastic, they're all really interesting, and I really enjoy books like this which give me like a little sampling of different authors, different classics, and different kind of traditions. And actually, whilst we're here, I'll just mention another one of these books, because if you're looking for more traditional folkloric tales, this one does have a few. So it's not solely dedicated to fairies, but it's Celtic weird, tales of wicked folklore and dark mythology. So again, folklore and mythology from different Celtic traditions, but exclusively Celtic traditions, and some of which include fairies. So yeah, just worth checking out this series in general. There's loads and loads of volumes. There's one on vampires. There's, yeah, like I won't start listing them here, but it's a really fun series. And it may actually surprise you that there aren't a ton of fairy tale retellings in this video, and that's because actually a lot of fairy tales themselves don't necessarily feature fairy protagonists. But one other fairy tale retelling that I do have to mention is Ash by Melinda Lowe, which is a young adult retelling of Cinderella, which features a sapphic romance, which I absolutely love. So you know the story of Cinderella, that's what we're exploring here, but we also have fairies taking a much more front and centre role than just say the brief inclusion of a fairy godmother like in the original fairy tale or in the Disney movie. We, again, like I said, have much more interaction with that world of the fairies, and in fact this link with the fairy world is something which also links our protagonist with her now deceased mother. But yeah, we're following, you know, your classic Cinderella kind of storyline, but with a surprise sapphic twist that you can look forward to. Another Beauty and the Beast retelling, on the other hand, is The Heart of the Fae by Emma Hamm, which is the first book in a series of novels retelling fairy tales. The first 2 of which are a duology retelling Beauty and the Beast, then we have a Little Mermaid retelling, then we have a retelling of The Swan Princess, and that also features fairies, so you'll find fairies come up quite often in this series. But the first book in particular, like I said, is inspired by Beauty and the Beast, and it is about a woman who makes a deal with the fairies to basically find a cure for a disease that is affecting the people in her community, and she has taken on a sort of healer role. She's trained in medicine, but she cannot cure this disease and she needs the fairies' help, which sends her on this like quest across the seas to a mysterious island that only appears once every few years and is ruled by a beastly fairy prince, and maybe they fall in love. I don't know, I wouldn't want to give it away to you. Then we have a children's or young adult horror novel called The Cuckoo Song. So I'd say this is like older end of middle grade, younger end of young adult, but obviously can be enjoyed by older. I read this book for the first time as an adult, and it's set in 1920s London following a young girl who had a sort of near-death experience in which I think she fell into a pond, if I remember correctly, but ever since she was saved from that near-death experience, she's been feeling a little bit odd. Her appetite has changed, she's been seeing strange things, and like maybe she didn't, you know, survive quite as intact as she thought she did. And it's set in a world in which there is a dark, creepy, fairy underworld, like underbelly to London society, and it's very creepy despite being a book for younger readers. And I think if you're ever trying to get into horror, try starting with children's and young adult horror. It's like a great like entry into the genre because it still manages to be pretty creepy whilst also kind of being a little bit less like terrifying, nightmarish, if that makes sense. And I thought this one was a really fun concept. I like the historical setting. It had some really interesting twists and turns that I wasn't expecting, and I would again just highly recommend it. I feel like I say that about all these books, but I would. On that theme, let's go with the last horror book of this video, which again is young adult, and that is House of Hollow. So this is a book which again I just absolutely love the way in which it interacts with traditional fairy folklore. Although in saying that, I don't know if the word fairy is ever used in this book to my memory, but it's very clear where the inspiration has been taken, so I feel like it's valid to include here. But this is about three sisters who, not dissimilarly to our last book, went missing briefly during a family trip to Edinburgh, and ever since they returned, they were just like a little bit different. Their personalities weren't necessarily different, but physically they'd changed, their hair had changed, and they became sort of a fascination to the media, and there were people who became sort of obsessed with them because of the press coverage that went on around their like disappearance and their return. And they've lived a slightly strange life because of that, and now that our youngest sibling is in her late teens, their oldest sister goes missing, and she and the middle sister have to find her. And I won't say any more than that, but really, really loved the lore and the world building in this book. I thought it was really, really well done, creepy. But I also think it was a novel which did a really good job of exploring like our relationships with our family and sisterhood and friendship, and I really loved that theme running through it. If you're still looking for some more like steamy fairy romance though, because I don't think I've mentioned a ton of those in this video, then I have like one that is peak steam for you, like peak steam, and that is Company of Fiends. So this is technically book 2 in a paranormal fantasy historical series, which begins with The Lady of Rooksgrave Manor. And I would start with book 1 if I'm being honest. Like I would start with book 1 in the trilogy, but fairies don't really play a part in book 1. It's book 2 where you'll find the fairies themselves. And like I said, this is a historical fantasy, so it's set in the 1800s, and it follows various women, so each book follows a different female protagonist as they are drawn into, or their relationship to the paranormal like sub-world of London. In book 1 we follow a maid who takes a new position as a companion to said monsters, and in book 2 we follow a member of a theatre troupe which is specifically exists within this monstrous world, which like entertains members of this monstrous world. And these books are very, very, very steamy. They're very sex positive, they're very sex forward if that's what you're looking for, but they also, like I said, like draw on various different folklores and mythologies and blend all these kind of paranormal worlds together and reference classic gothic literature, and I love that kind of thing. Like I love books like that where you can be like, oh, I think that's inspired by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or oh no, like there we've got a little bit of traditional Scottish fairy folklore, and I love that, as well as obviously the romances at the heart of them. Every single one is a why choose, and they're just a ton of fun. And then last but certainly not least, we have another young adult novel, which is Summers at Castle Auburn. This is another kind of cozy book. It's quite a like slow paced, kind of quiet book. I think the title even kind of gives you a sense of what you're getting. You're following our main character who isn't from quite as wealthy a background but has wealthy friends in this fantastical world, and she spends summers hanging out with them and playing with them at their castle. And now they're a little bit older, you know, they're teenagers, and maybe some of their relationships are starting to change slightly. But this is also a world in which there are fairies fairies. There are fairies who live in their fairy realm, but there are also fairies who have been enslaved in the human world. And while those are all of the books I wanted to recommend to you, maybe I should also just quickly mention that my novel, which also comes out in May, does in fact have fairy lore in it, because it's inspired by Arthurian legend, which is somewhere you will find fairy lore cropping up now and again. So if you're just more generally interested in Arthurian legend, I did recently film a video dedicated to literature on that subject, so you can also check that out. But yeah, those are some of my favourite fairy books from across the genres, across the age ranges. Hopefully you find a new recommendation here. There's at least one book that you haven't read before but think you might like to. I think they're all fantastic in their own right. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, if you're interested in reading some traditional folk tales about fairies and their kin from around the world, then I do have an anthology coming out in May which does exactly that. It features stories from Scotland, Japan, Iceland, Wales, France, and many, many more places, all of which I think are incredibly interesting in their own right. And that will be out on May 8th. But until next time, I would love to hear about your fairy book recommendations, whether they're fiction, non-fiction, romance, horror. Give them all to me right now because I want to go read them. And until next time, I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.